day, to save us all from Satan's power when we had gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, comfort and joy. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy. Good evening. Thank you for coming out. I am Drew Gibson.
And I'm Don Kuehlhorn. More than 150 years ago, Charles Dickens wrote a ghost story. Since it takes place around the time of Christmas, it is somewhat like an advent calendar. You know, those little paper calendars, often in the shape of a house or a tree, with windows in them that open each day as you get closer and closer to Christmas.
And like an advent calendar, this story is a series of windows into the London of Dickens's time, allowing us to peep in on a variety of Christmas scenes. But all these pictures are for a purpose: to raise a ghost, the ghost of an idea. May it haunt your lives pleasantly.
To begin with, Marley was dead. Oh, there is no doubt whatsoever about that. His burial was registered by the clergyman, the clerk, and the undertaker. Scrooge also signed the book, and his name was as good as any bill of exchange. Yes, old Marley was dead as a doornail.
Not that there is anything particularly dead about a doornail, at least not from my own personal knowledge. I would have regarded a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery that there is. But you get our meaning. Marley was dead, and Scrooge knew it.
Scrooge had been his business partner for I don't know how many years. It was his sole executor, sole administrator, sole friend, sole mourner, and even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event of his passing.
Now, Scrooge never painted out Marley's name from where it stood above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. People new to the business sometimes called Scrooge Scrooge and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him, even though Marley was certainly and undeniably dead.
Now, Scrooge, oh, but he was a tight-fisted one, a squeezing, grasping, wrenching, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner.
Hard and as sharp as flint, but without even a warming spark. Secret was he, solitary, and self-contained as an oyster.
The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red and his thin lips blue. He always carried his own lone temperature with him, and his warmth could not warm him, nor could any wintry weather chill him.
Now, once upon a time, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, foggy weather, and although only striking 3, already quite dark. The door of Scrooge's office was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who sat in a dismal little cell just beyond his own. Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's was so very much smaller that it looked to be just one coal. Now, he dared not replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his office, and the clerk knew that if he were to go to Scrooge's office, go to the coal box with his shovel, he might well return without his job. So he tried to warm himself at his candle, but being a man of no great imagination, he failed in this attempt.
Suddenly a voice popped up in the cheeriest of tones. "Oh, Merry Christmas to you, Uncle! God save you!" It was Scrooge's nephew coming in and announced. His face was ruddy from his walk through the frosty afternoon, and his eyes sparkled with good health. "Ha, there you are! Merry Christmas!"
A humbug.
"Oh, Christmas, a humbug, Uncle! You don't mean that, I am sure."
I do. Can't you see that I'm busy? Merry Christmas indeed. What right have you to be so merry? You're poor enough.
"Well, come then," replied the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be so dismal? You're rich enough."
What's Christmas but a time for finding yourself 1 year older and not an hour richer? Why, it's a time for you, sir, to pay bills that you cannot afford. If I had my way, every idiot who goes about with a Merry Christmas upon his lips should be boiled in his own pudding.
Uncle,
You see here, you keep Christmas your way and let me keep it mine.
keep it, but that's just it. You don't keep it.
Well, let me leave it alone then. Much good may it do me. Much good has it done you or anyone.
Uncle, there are so many things from which I have derived goodness, but from which I have not specifically profited. Christmas is, I dare say, any among them. But Christmas time is such a good time, not only for its sacred, precious origin, but as a kind time, a pleasant time, a forgiving and charitable time. It is the only time I know of when men and women seem by one common consent to open their shuttered hearts freely, to think the people around them are as they are, fellow travelers on the same journey, which ends for all of us in the same place. But therefore, though it has never put a scrap of silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will continue to say so, and I say, God bless it.
To which sentiment the clerk in the solitary office beyond quietly seconded, "Hear, hear." But with a slap, Scrooge silenced that approbation.
No, Uncle, don't be angry with me. I say, come dine with us tomorrow.
Eh? I'll see you buried first.
Uncle,
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. But I will keep my Christmas humor at the last. So, Merry Christmas, Uncle! And a Happy New Year!
Humbug! While
the clerk let the nephew out with all the greetings of the seasons, he also let in two large, portly gentlemen who stood before him, hats off, in Scrooge's office. They had notebooks in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?"
it is no pleasure for me, sir, to be addressed by either of you. Marley's been dead 7 years ago. He died 7 years ago this very night.
Oh, our sincere condolences, but we have no doubt that his generosity is well represented by his surviving partner.
Well, he was right about that, because Scrooge and Marley were of one mind when it came to generosity.
At this festive time of the season, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common comforts and even necessities.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the workhouses, are they still in operation?
Well, they are, though I wish I could say they are not.
That is a relief. I was afraid something might have stopped their useful work.
Yes, as you say, but since they scarcely furnish to those unoffending multitudes any Christmas cheer of mind or body, we are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some food and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
Oh, you wish to remain anonymous?
I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I do not make merry myself at Christmas, and I cannot afford to make idle people merry. Those who are poorly off must go to the workhouses and prisons, which I support, with my quite considerable taxes, mind you. So they must badly off, they have to go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die first.
Well, if they would rather die, they had best do it quickly and decrease the surplus population.
But surely at this time of the year...
It is not my business, sirs. It is enough for a man to understand his own business and to not interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me greatly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
At length the hour of shuttering up arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted his stool, thus signaling to his clerk that the day was over. Instantly the clerk had his hat on and snuffed out the candle.
You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose.
If it's quite convenient to you, sir.
It's not convenient, and it's not fair. Why, if I weren't to pay you, you'd think that pretty rough treatment, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir, but it's only once a year, sir.
A fine excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Still, I suppose you must have the whole day. Just mind that you're in here all the earlier the following morning.
And with that, the office is closed in a twinkling. The clerk, with his long white scarf dangling below his waist, for he boasted no winter coat, ran home as hard as ever he could to join his family.
Well, Scrooge took his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having scrutinized the papers and his banker's book, went home. He lived in chambers that had once belonged to his deceased partner, a gloomy pile of rooms at the end of a narrow yard. Nobody lived there but Scrooge, all the rooms having been let out as offices. The yard was dark, and the fog and the frost hung thick about it all as Scrooge walked up the path to the door. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door of this house except that it was somewhat large. Scrooge had, of course, seen it morning and evening during his residence there. It is also a fact that Scrooge had as little of what we might call fancy as any man in the financial district. But that evening, having his key in the lock of the door, Scrooge saw not a brass knocker, but Marley's face.
Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, and it looked at Scrooge the way Marley used to look at him. Its ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred as if by a current of hot air. And although the eyes were open, they were perfectly, horribly motionless.
As Scrooge stared fixedly at this phenomenon, it became a knocker again. "Pooh, pooh," he said, and slammed the door with a bang. But he did look at the back of the door, half expecting to see Marley's pigtail sticking through the back of it. But there was nothing there. The sound of the door closing resounded through all the empty rooms like thunder, every room above and the cellars below, each giving out their own echoes. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, but still, he locked that door extra carefully. He walked up the stairs to his apartment in the dark. Now, Scrooge did not mind the dark because darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked that. But before he shut the door to his own rooms, he walked back and forth through the apartment just to make sure. The face upon the door was enough to make him want to do that.
Everything was as it should be. Nobody under the table or sofa, a small fire in the grate, and his dressing gown hanging undisturbed in his closet, as it should. He locked himself in and took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown, slippers, and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire.
He sat in his chair, and as he leaned his head back, he noticed something odd. A disused bell hanging high on the wall and connected for some now forgotten purpose to elsewhere in the building slowly began to swing of its own accord. With a sense of foreboding, Scrooge watched as it rang out loudly, and then heard every other bell in the house also beginning to ring out with it. But before he could make any sense of this, he heard a muffled clanking, deep, deep down below in the cellars, sounding as if someone was dragging a heavy chain across the barrels down there.
The noise became louder and clearer on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming down the hallway, coming straight towards his door. It came on, coming right through the heavy door, and a ghost passed into the room.
Scrooge stared at it with a mixture of astonishment and dread, and then he recognized the spectacles, the pigtail, the waistcoat, tights, and boots. It was Marley, or at least the ghostly remains of him. Scrooge observed that his partner had a chain clasped around his middle, a long, thick chain which stretched out behind him and which appeared to be made out of ledgers and cash boxes and padlocks, all wrought from some ghostly steel. Scrooge looked at this phantom, and he looked through it, but he didn't believe it. He felt its death-cold eyes upon him, and he even noticed the kerchief that held its chin up to its head. Still, he doubted it. Then, "How now? What do you want from me?
Much, said a voice, and there was no doubt that the voice was Marley's.
Who are you?
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley.
Yes, I am getting on, aren't I? Oh, dear me. First the door, now this. Oh, dear me.
You don't believe me? You doubt your own senses? Why do you doubt what you yourself see and hear?
Because one's senses can so easily lie. After all, a slight disorder of the stomach might produce a mild hallucination. You might be nothing more than an undigested bit of beef, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of underdone potato. Why, there's probably more of gravy than the grave about you.
Oh, yelled the ghost, holding up what chains it could and shaking them with a deafening rattle, while it howled a piteous and mournful wail. It was a shriek of rage, dismay, and the most heart-breaking sadness. Is this undigested bit of beef?
Shaken, terrified out of his wits, Scrooge fell to his knees. Oh, Spirit, please forgive me. Please have mercy on me. I do believe you, I do. But why do you come? And why do you walk the earth in this fashion?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk among his fellow men. And if he does not go forth he is condemned to do as and in his death. And I cannot rest. I cannot linger anywhere because it is life. It is I and my spirit who never walked beyond the narrow limits of our counting house. I was once foolish enough not to realize the vast usefulness we have to give to our fellow creatures. Any Christian loving soul working kindly knows this, but I did not, and you do not. Neither do you realize that no amount of regret can make up for the wasting life's precious opportunities for doing good. Now, weary journeys stretch out before me forever.
You always were a good man of business, Jacob.
Business, cried the ghost. Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, they were my business. My trade was but a drop of water in what should have been the ocean of my real business.
And at this, the ghost picked up a length of that chain, a chain he had unknowingly wrought for himself, link by link, and flung it heavily upon the ground.
It is at this time of the year that I suffer most. Why did I as a man never notice the blessed star, the star that led the wise men to the stable, and which still shines as a beacon in the hearts of men? Was there no homes to which light it could have led me? Hear me!
Please, Jacob, don't be hard on me.
I am here to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate. A chance that I have procured for you, Ebenezer.
You always were a good friend, thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Well, Jacob, not to be ungrateful, but if that is the favor, I'd rather not.
Hear me, he wailed, shaking his chains at Scrooge. Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I walk. Expect the first when the bell tolls 1.
And as Scrooge watched, the spirit that had been Jacob Marley vanished in the direction of the window. Pooh! Humbug! Was his nervous response. But drained from the interview, he retired to his bed without undressing and fell asleep on the instant.
When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out between his bed curtains, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the wall of his chamber. Suddenly, the church clock tolled a deep, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room in an instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, one who was like a child and an old man at the same time. His long hair was white with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle on it. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand, while in contrast, the dress was trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of the head there sprung a clear, bright jet of light, by which all of this was visible.
Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold?
I am the ghost of Christmas past,
Long past?
your past. Rise and walk with me. And the spirit's grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. As I touch my hand here, you will not fall, said the spirit, and he laid his hand upon Scrooge's heart.
As he did so, the two of them passed through the wall and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city. By the frost in the air and the dressing of the shops, it was clear that here, too, it was Christmas time. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse, which Scrooge immediately recognized as the place of his own apprenticeship. They passed through the walls and beheld a rather large gentleman in an old-fashioned, high-powdered wig, sitting behind a very high desk. Scrooge cried out in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig, alive again!"
Mr. Fezziwig was just laying down his pen to look up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and laughed all over himself, from his shoes to his nose, as he called out in a comfortable, booming voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!"
And a living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self as a young man came into the room accompanied by his fellow apprentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure. There he is. Ah, bless me. Good old Dick."
"Yo-ho, my boy," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. Clear away, lads. Clear away, and let's have lots of room here."
It was done in a trice. Everything movable was packed off. The floor was swept and watered. The lamps were trimmed. Fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse became as snug, warm, and as bright a ballroom as you could wish. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk, making an orchestra of it. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. And in came their 6 followers, whose hearts they broke.
In came the young men and women employed in the business, as well as the baker, the cook, the housemaid, and the milkman. In they came one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some pushing, some pulling. And soon 20 couples were all dancing at once, down the middle and up again, round and round in various groupings. Old Fezziwig clapped his hands and cried out, "Oh, well done!" to the fiddler, who bowed, plunged his face into a mug of beer, and continued.
There were dances, games, and still more dances. There was cake, punch, cold roast, boiled ham, and mince pies. The high point of the evening came when the fiddler struck up that sprightly old air, Sir Roger de Coverley, and Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood out to dance as the head couple. Now, they had their work cut out for them because everyone there could dance and were not to be trifled with. But Mrs. Fezziwig, she was a worthy partner in every sense of the term.
And Mr. Fezziwig? Oh, why, a light seems to positively shine from his silk-stocking calves. The couple shone in every part of the dance, the bow and curtsy, turn your partner, thread the needle. Why, old Fezziwig was so deft that his legs veritably twinkled.
When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations on either side of the door, and shaking hands with every person individually, wished them all a Merry Christmas.
"A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. He has spent but 3 or 4 pounds of your mortal money at the most. Is there so much that he deserves such praise?"
To this, Scrooge objected, pointing out that it wasn't the money, but that Fezziwig had the power to render them happy or unhappy, to make their service light or burdensome, and the happiness that he gave was quite as great as if it had cost a fortune. And so saying, Scrooge became thoughtful and still, for he would have very much liked to have said a few words to his own clerk just then.
Then the scene changed and faded and melted away. In the scene that emerged, Scrooge saw himself once more, only this time he was older, in the prime of his life.
He sat in a parlor, with music in the rooms behind him. He was sitting on a settee by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, and in whose eyes were tears.
"That matters little to you," Very little, but I see another has displaced me in your heart. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one, Ebenezer, and until this master passion, gain of money, has engrossed you. That is your true love, is it not?
What are you saying? It's just that I have grown so much older and wiser, that's all, said this version of Scrooge. Have I changed toward you? Have I ever sought release from our engagement?
In words, no, never. But in a changed nature and an altered spirit, yes. If you were free today, can I believe that you would again choose a poor girl such as I, who has no dowry? I know you regret it and repent of it, and so I release you. I do so with a full heart, for the love of him who once you were.
Oh, Spirit, Spirit, must you? Let us leave this place at once, please.
These are shadows of things that have been. They are what they are. Do not blame me.
Please, really, remove me. I cannot bear it.
And as Scrooge struggled with the spirit, he was suddenly conscious of an irresistible drowsiness. He had barely time to notice that his bed was once again before him, and he collapsed upon it and sank into a heavy sleep.
Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, Scrooge sat up in bed to get his thoughts together. After his last encounter, he was quite prepared for anything, but he was not, by any means, prepared for nothing. He huddled under the bedclothes, the heavy curtains of the bed drawn tight together, and listened. He waited for some new specter to approach, but there was nothing there, only silence. And then the church bell again struck 1. He heard the crackling of a fire, and peering out, saw light from underneath the door to his sitting room. He rose, cracked the door open, and peeked in to see a fantastic transformation. The walls and ceiling of his sitting room were so hung with living green ivy, mistletoe, and holly that it looked a perfect grove. There was a mighty blaze roaring up the chimney, more exuberant than any in Scrooge's day, and the light of it reflected off all the little holly leaves like so many hundreds of tiny mirrors.
Heaped upon the floor, forming a kind of throne, were cooked turkeys, geese, and game, great joints of meat, suckling pigs, and wreaths of sausages. There were minced pies, plum puddings, chestnuts, and cherry-cheeked apples, oranges, pears, immense cakes, and great bowls of punch. Such a glory! In easy state, upon the couch, sat a ghost. A giant ghost, wonderful to see, who, as soon as he noticed Scrooge peeping in around the door, bellowed out at him, "Ha, ha, ha, ha! Come in, man, come in and know me better. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Ha, ha!"
Scrooge entered meekly and beheld the great figure who nearly touched the high ceiling of the room, and who was clad in one simple deep green robe bordered with white fur. The garment hung loosely on his great frame so that his broad chest was bare, as were his feet. A wreath of holly was on his brow, and in his upraised hand he held what looked like a horn, like a drinking horn or a horn of plenty, but from which glowed golden, joyous particles of light.
"Do you know me or any of my family?" said the giant. "There have been over 1,800 of us, you know."
"I do not."
"Come, touch my robe."
Scrooge did so, and he and the giant passed invisible through the walls and out into the streets of the city on a Christmas morning. That it was Christmas Day was clear from the bustle of the people in the streets and their good humor. Men shoveled snow from the rooftops and doorsteps. Children laughed. Steam billowed out from the few shops still open. On these pleasant scenes, the giant sprinkled the blessings of his torch, making them pleasanter still.
Invisible, Scrooge and the ghost passed through neighborhoods filled with Christmas scenes until they arrived at the street where Scrooge's clerk lived with his family. Coming to the house of Bob Cratchit, for that was the clerk's name, the giant blessed the house with the sprinklings of his torch. Imagine that, blessing the house of this miserable Bob Cratchit, who made but 15 shillings a week.
They passed through the wall of the house to observe the complete picture. of one family's Christmas. They saw a busy Mrs. Cratchit, dressed in an old gown made fresh with ribbons, for ribbons are cheap and make a good show for sixpence. She and Belinda, the second Cratchit daughter, were laying the tablecloth while Master Peter plunged a fork into a saucepan of potatoes. At age 14, he felt quite the grown-up and was nearly choking on the high starched collar he had borrowed from his father for the occasion.
The two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the neighborhood bake shop they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. Basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, these young Cratchits danced about the table, whooping in anticipation of the dinner soon to come.
"Whatever has got your precious father and your brother Tiny Tim?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "And Martha? Why, she weren't even this late last year."
"Oh, here's Martha now," said one of the smaller Cratchits as Martha appeared at the door. "Well, wait till you smell the goose," they said as they danced around her, chattering excitedly, seeming to be everywhere at once. She apologized for being late, but as an apprentice in the shop that made bonnets and fancy stuff, she had to work late the night before and that morning.
"Well, just so long as you've come, dear, that's the thing."
Finally, Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, came in with 3 feet of scarf hanging down before him. His threadbare clothes were darned and brushed to look as good as they might. His son, Tiny Tim, rode upon his shoulder, but alas, he carried a little crutch in his hand, and his body was supported by an iron brace.
Martha ran into her father's arms as the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim off to hear the pudding singing as it boiled away in the copper kettle.
"How was church, dear?" asked Mrs. Cratchit. "How did little Tim behave?"
"Oh, as good as gold and better," said Bob. "He gets thoughtful, you know, sitting by himself so much, and he thinks the strangest things you've ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people in the church saw him because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant for them to reflect upon Christmas Day and upon him who made the lame beggars walk and the blind men see."
The short silence that followed was quickly broken by an active little crutch tapping upon the floor as Tim and the others came back. Tiny Tim took up his stool near the fire, while Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went forward to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession.
Mrs. Cratchit had the gravy hissing hot.
Peter mashed the potatoes with vigor,
Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce,
while Martha dusted off the hot plates.
Bob placed Tiny Tim beside him in a corner of the table, and the 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody.
At last, all was set, and grace was said, which was followed by a breathless pause as Mrs. Cratchit began to carve. When the long-expected gush of steam and juices issued forth, one common murmur of delight arose all around the board. Even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
Never was there such a goose, nor cooked so well. Its tenderness, flavor, size, and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for all 8 of them. Indeed, surveying one small fleck left upon a bone, Mrs. Cratchit laughed and said they hadn't eaten it all. The younger Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to their eyebrows. Then the plates were cleared, and Mrs. Cratchit rose to take up the pudding. Soon there was a great rush of steam from the kitchen. A Christmas pudding is, as you must know, bits of dried fruit, meat, breadcrumbs, spices, and flour, all wrapped together in a cloth and set to boil in a big pot. When Mrs. Cratchit opened the big copper kettle, the released steam smelled first like wash day. Well, that was the cloth. Then, as the pudding was turned out, the smells of a pastry shop and an eating house seemed to merge with the steam, forming a sweet aroma that billowed out an army of expectant noses. Smiling proudly, Mrs. Cratchit entered with the pudding, like a bespectacled cannonball ablaze in half a quarter cup of ignited brandy, bedight with a Christmas holly.
Oh, what a wonderful pudding. Bob Cratchit proclaimed it to be the greatest success of Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or even thought that it was at all a small pudding for so large a family. They would have blushed to think it. At last, dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, and the fire was made up. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, a shovelful of chestnuts upon the fire, and all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth. At Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family's complete collection of glass, 2 cups and a custard cup without a handle. Into these golden goblets, Bob served out a hot punch with a beaming smile, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and crackled noisily. And then Bob proposed a toast.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, which sentiment was echoed by all the family, ending with a thin,
God bless us, everyone,
yes.
from Tiny Tim.
Yes, he sat upon his little stool, very close to his father's side, and Bob held his hand, withered little hand, in his, as if he dreaded any might be taken from him. It was a scene so tender that to it no one could be immune.
Spirit, I say, tell me, will Tiny Tim live?
Oh, I see a vacant chair and a crutch without an owner, if these shadows remain unaltered by the future.
No, kind spirit, no. Say he will be spared.
Why? What of it? If he likes to die, he had better do it soon and decrease the surplus population.
Scrooge bowed his head before this rebuke, but he raised it suddenly, for he had heard his own voice, his own name.
To Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, to the founder of the feast.
The founder of the feast, indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon.
My dear, shh, the children. It's Christmas Day.
It could only be on Christmas Day, I am sure, that one would drink the health of such an odious, stingy, unfeeling piece of flint as is Mr. Scrooge. You know it's true, Robert. No one knows it better than you.
My dear, it is Christmas Day. Join my toast.
Oh, all right. I'll drink his health, but for your sake and the sake of the day, not for his. Long life to him. There. I have no doubt, but he'll be making very merry today. It took a few minutes for the shadow caused by the mere mention of Scrooge's name to pass from the little scene. But then they were 10 times happier than before, if only to be done with Mr. Scrooge, the ogre of the family. And they chatted of work, of happy memories, and of future hopes. And as they spoke, the chestnuts and the punch went round and round. Tiny Tim gave them a song about a child lost traveling in the snow. And with his plaintive little voice, he sang it very well indeed.
There was nothing of high mark in any of this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their clothes were even scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with the one around them, contented with the time, and when they faded from view, Scrooge had his eye thoughtfully upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim.
And then the scene dimmed, vanished, and Scrooge was surprised to hear a very hearty laugh. He was further surprised to recognize it as that of his own nephew. And he was surprised all the more to find himself standing in a bright, gleaming room with the giant by his side.
It is a fair and even and noble adjustment of things that while disease and sorrow can be infectious, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter. When Scrooge's nephew laughed, his wife laughed as heartily, and he and their friends all laughed as well. He said, no, he said that Christmas was a humbug as I live.
For shame to him, Fred, said his wife.
Oh, he's a comical old fellow. That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. But I have nothing to say against him, for who suffers from his old ill whims? Himself, always himself. Here, he takes it in his head to dislike us, won't come to dine with us. And what is the result? That he loses a very good dinner.
And to this, everyone concurred, having just consumed the dinner in question, and it was very good indeed.
I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not. By this time, Fred, his wife, their friends and relatives had clustered around the fireplace and were singing some songs they played at games, for it is good to be a child sometimes, and never better than at Christmas, whose mighty founder was, after all, a child himself. They played blind man's buff, and on a village I did go, and yet who, what, or where.
Scrooge became so engaged in these guessing games that he forgot why he was there in the first place, and that his voice made no impression upon their ears. He sometimes called his guesses out loud, and very often he guessed right. His attitude had changed to such a remarkable degree that he begged like a child not to be taken from the scene just yet. Just 1/2 hour more, Spirit, only that. For they had just started a game of yes or no. His nephew had thought of something, and the rest were trying to find out what it was by having him answer their questions with a simple yes or no. The fire of questioning to which Fred was exposed showed that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable live animal, a disagreeable animal that grunted and sometimes growled. Yes, it lived in London, but no, it didn't live in a zoo. Yes, it walked about the streets, but no, it was not a horse, or a dog, or a cow, or a tiger, or a bear. Fred was so tickled by each of his friends' bepuzzlement that with every new question he burst into a fresh roar of laughter. And then, at last, one of his wife's sisters cried out,
I know what it is, Freddie. I know who it is. It is your Uncle Scrooge.
which it certainly was, and all laughed over it. Some, however, objected that the answer to, "Is it a bear?" should have been a yes. Ebenezer Scrooge, watching and listening to all of this, had become so light of heart that he would have drunk the health of the entire company if they had been sensible of him. Then the scene misted and passed off, and he and the Spirit were once again upon their travels.
They traveled far and saw much, visiting many homes and also workplaces. They visited places that were busy and places that were lonely, but always they saw people keeping Christmas, even with only to share the blessings of the day. The Spirit stood by sick beds, stood amongst poverty. He stood near struggling, desperate men, and all were made lighter in their hearts by the blessings of his torch. In the workhouse, hospital, or jail, in misery's every refuge, the Spirit left his blessings and taught Scrooge his precepts.
Then, just before the bell tolled, the giant brought from within the many folds of his robe 2 ragged children who knelt and clutched at the skirts of his garment. Meager, yellow, wolfish, wretched, miserable, and alone, these 2 appeared to be immune from the blessings of the giant's torch.
Their bodies, wherein youth and grace belonged, had been pinched and twisted into things abject. On their faces, where hopeful angels might have sat, even devils harked and glowered. The perverse chance mutations of creatures have never formed monsters half as horrible as these.
Spirit! Spirit! Those children! Whose are they? Are they yours?
They are man's. The girl is want, the boy is ignorance. Beware them, heed them, or abide the doom that they will bring forth.
Why is there no shelter for them? No refuge?
Are there no prisons? Are the workhouses all full?
And the bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about, but the ghost and the wretched children were gone. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Marley that he would be visited by 3 spirits. And lifting up his eyes, he beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
The phantom approached him slowly, silently. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, face, and form, leaving nothing visible save one outstretched hand.
Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come? I think I fear you above the others, but as I hope to be a different man from what I was, I am prepared to learn from you. Will you not speak to me?
But it gave no reply. Its hand only pointed straight before them, and as Scrooge looked, the business district of the city seemed to spring up about them. And there they were in the very heart of it, at the corner of the exchange. The spirit stopped beside a little knot of businessmen and pointed to them. Scrooge knew these men, for he had made a point always of standing well in their esteem, strictly from a business point of view, you understand. He now advanced towards them to listen, and he assumed to learn from their talk.
No, I don't know much about it, said a great fat man. I only know that he's dead.
Oh, when did he die? Inquired a red.
Last night.
I thought he'd never die, said another. So, what has he done with his money?
I haven't heard, but I know this. He hasn't left it to me.
With this pleasantry, the subject was closed and conversation moved to other topics. Scrooge was surprised that the spirit should direct him to such apparently so trivial a conversation, but feeling that there must be some purpose to it, he tried to make out what it could be. While pondering this, he looked about for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner. Well, this did not bother him because he had been turning around in his head that he would alter his way of life, and he hoped that the changes in scene before him had confirmed the carrying out of his newborn resolutions.
Scrooge and the spirit then left the busy street and traveled into an obscure part of town. They went far into an infamous quarter and came to a low, mean, beetling old shop where scrap iron, bones, bottles, and rags were bought. Inside, there was a gaunt, gray-haired rascal of great age who sat there smoking his pipe among piles of iron, bones, rusty hardware, and mountains of dirty rags. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman slunk in with a heavy bundle. She looked to be one of the lower sorts of housemaids or cleaning women.
Well, what do you got? What do you got there to sell me?
And the woman slung the bundle to the floor where Joe, as was his name, knelt down to examine it.
It looks like you've been picking good, I think.
Oh, it's my opinion, but if him what owned these things wanted him to stay in place when he was dead, he should have acted more natural when he was alive. That way he had someone to look after him when he was struck down, instead of lying there alone to gasp out his last. Wicked old miser. So, Joe, what's the value of it, eh?
Let's see, what do you got here? Bed curtains, I like. What, you mean you took down the bed curtains, rings and all, with him lying there?
Yes, I did, and why not? I shan't hold my hand back from one such as him. He never held his hand back, that's sure. Besides, who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man. Now, how about them blankets, eh?
What are these blankets? What? Cool. You mean to tell me you took them while he was lying there? God, you are a cool one.
I certainly did. Where he's going, blankets is one thing he won't be needing. And looky here, this shirt is best one. Not a old or threadbare place in it. Why, they'd have wasted it, sure, dressing the likes of him with it to be buried in.
You took off his own shirt.
Yes, I did. This is the end of it, don't you see? He frightened everyone away while he was alive so as to profit us when he was dead.
All right, you've got a good head for business. That's the truth.
Scrooge listened in a sort of horror to these two vultures as they sat huddled over the dead man's belongings. Spirit, I see, I understand. The case of the unhappy man they've robbed might well have been my own. My own life did tend in that way before.
Then, abruptly, once more the scene changed, and Scrooge stood before a bare, uncurtained bed, pale in the waning afternoon light. On it, unwept, unwatched, uncared for, was the body of the plundered, unknown man. It lay in a dark, empty house, in a lonely room, its face in shadow, and with not a man, woman, or child to say that they remembered him or how he had been kind to them in this or that way. There were no prayers or sobs or muffled, respectful talking, just the noise of a cat in the hall and the gnawing of rats beneath the hearth place.
Spirit, is there no person who feels some emotion for this man's death? Show me that person and that emotion, I beg you.
The phantom hesitated, and then spread his dark robe before him like a wing. Withdrawing it, he beheld a poor room by daylight, with a mother and child within. The woman showed every sign of anxious eagerness as she hurried to open the door to her husband, whose young face was etched with the strain of worry.
The news, she asked, the news. Is it good or bad? Is he determined to see us ruined, or will he relent?
And a smile slowly broke over the husband's face. Well, he is past all relenting, I dare say. Apparently, the housekeeper was telling the truth yesterday when she said he was too ill to see me. I thought he refused to hear my request for a week's grace out of plain meanness. And it seems that he was at that moment dying.
To which the woman replied, bowing her head, softly whispering, "Thank God."
I don't know to whom our debt will be transferred, but it will be hard indeed to find another creditor as merciless as he.
And the faces of the children in the room, who stood clustered nearby, brightened. They could not understand what was being said, but they could sense that theirs was now a happier home for this man's death. But that was the only emotion the spirit could show Scrooge.
Nay, nay, Spirit, is there no tender concern connected with the death? Let me see some feelings of tenderness, I beg you.
Once more the scene changed, misted over, and again they were dwelling in the Cratchit family. Mother and daughters were seated around the fire doing piecework. The little Cratchits were sitting in one corner, as still as statues, while Peter read to them all from a book. And he took a little child and he set him in the midst of them. But Peter stopped abruptly as his mother laid down her work on the table and put her hand to her face.
It's nothing, said Mrs. Cratchit. It's the needlework. It's these colors. They hurt my eyes.
But it wasn't the colors, poor woman. It was Tiny Tim.
Now, we mustn't show weak or teary eyes to your father, not for the world. Why, it's time for him to be home, isn't it?
Past time, said Peter. I think he's walking slower than he used to. He used to walk so very fast with Tim on his shoulder. He was so light that it was no trouble. No trouble at all. As he spoke, Bob Cratchit came to the door in his long white scarf, which he sorely needed in the cold. His tea was ready for him, and they all tried to help him to see who could help him the most. The two little Cratchits pressed their cheeks to his as if to say, "Don't be sad, Father." But Bob spoke pleasantly to all the family, and surveying the work upon the table, praised the industry of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls.
Did you go today, Robert?
Asked his wife.
Yes, my dear, and it will do you good to see how sweet a place it is. And you'll see it often, I think, for I promised him that we would walk there every Sunday. My little child, my little child. He broke down in tears. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been further apart than perhaps they were. Bob went upstairs to the little room that was lighted and hung cheerfully with Christmas. Poor Bob. He sat down in a chair next to the cold little form, and when he had composed himself, kissed the cold, still little face.
Witnessing this scene, Scrooge felt a sudden, sharp pang of apprehension. "A spirit," he said. "This is important. I need to know. What man was it we saw lying dead upon that curtainless bed?"
But the ghost did not speak. Instead, the scene misted and rearranged itself, this time into a bleak, dismal churchyard. Standing among the graves, the spirit pointed a spectral finger down to one.
"Before I draw near to this stone, please tell me, are these the shadows of things that will be, or the shadows of things that may be only?"
But the ghost did not answer. It only pointed down at the grave.
"The course of a man's life foreshadows certain ends, it's true. But if the course be changed, the end will also change. Say it is thus for what you're about to show me."
But the spirit remained mute and immovable, pointing still. Scrooge crept towards the spot, trembling as he went, and read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
"Am I that man who lay upon that curtainless bed? Oh, no, spirit, no. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I might have been. Oh, I will hold Christmas in my heart and keep it whole the year. Oh, please, spirit, assure me that with an altered life I may yet change these shadows you have shown me." And holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. The happiest of all the time before him was his own. It was not too late. Rising to the window, he opened it and put out his head. No fog, no mist, no night, only clear, bright, stirring, golden day. He shouted down to the boy in the Sunday clothes upon the street,
I say, what's today?
"Today? Why, I love me, sir. It's Christmas Day."
Ah, it's Christmas. Hello, I haven't missed it.
And thinking quickly, he again asked,
So I say, young man, do you know the poultry shop 2 streets over?
"Why, yes, I should hope I do, sir."
Yes, you are remarkable, most intelligent.
Well, do you know, have they sold the prize turkey hanging in the window?
"Oh, what? The one as big as me? Why, it's hanging there now."
Aha! Oh, delightful young fellow. Go and tell them that I shall buy it. Have a man come and that I may tell him where to take it. Come back with the man and I'll give you a shilling. Bring him in less than 5 minutes and I'll give you a half-crown.
And the boy was off through the snowy streets like a shot.
Ha ha! I'll send it to Bob Cratchit. Ha! He shan't know who sent it. Why, it's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
and Scrooge laughed to think that such a joke as this played on Bob Cratchit, there never was. Well, he then dressed himself in his best and soon went out into the streets where people were pouring forth to share the day with friends and loved ones. As he walked through the bustling streets, Scrooge regarded everyone with a broad smile. 3 or 4 good-humored fellows, not recognizing him, said,
"Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you."
and Scrooge said afterwards that of all the sweet sounds he had ever heard, those words were the sweetest.
He headed towards his nephew's house, and when he reached it, he passed back and forth in the street several times before he had the courage to go up to the door and knock upon it. "Oh, why, bless my soul," said Fred. "Who's this?"
It's I, your uncle. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in?
Let him in? It's a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could have been heartier. Everything looked just the same as he had seen it with the giant. A wonderful party, wonderful dinner, wonderful games, a wonderful oneness of heart.
Scrooge was early in the office the next morning. Oh, it would be fun if only he could be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming in late. Oh, that would be capital. The clock struck 9. No Bob. It struck 1:15. No Bob.
Bob Cratchit was a full 18 minutes and a half past behind his time when he came in. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his scarf too. He was on his stool in a jiffy and driving away with his pen as if he was trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
"Hello," growled Scrooge, trying to replicate his old accustomed voice.
What do you mean by coming here at this time of day,
I'm
sir?
very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
Yes, you are. Step this way, please.
It was only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. The truth is, I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, let me tell you, my friend, I am not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore,
he said, poking Bob in the ribs,
I am going to have to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and grimaced and started back a bit. For a moment, he had the idea of knocking Scrooge down and calling out for a straight-waist jacket.
"And Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness in his voice that could not be mistaken. "A merrier Christmas, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary, that I will, and I will do my best to help your family. And to that end, we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop." That's hot punch. "Make up the fires, Bob Cratchit, and before you dot another I, go out on the company's account and buy us some more coal."
Scrooge was as good as his word, and then some. To Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was like a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as a good old city knew. Some people laughed to see his alteration in him, but it did not matter to Scrooge, for his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him.
Although it may sound strange, Scrooge had no further meetings with spirits, for he had no need. Moreover, it was always said of him that of any man living, it was Scrooge who knew how to keep Christmas well. May that truly be said of all of us. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed the show, please tell your friends. We'll be doing a performance at the library on Woodmere Street tomorrow at 2 o'clock and also on Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And if you're really ambitious, we're also doing a show next Sunday at Glen Arbor at the Bethlehem Lutheran Church. Thanks again.